Boker Tov, Eric. Let's Sephir the Aleph Tav.
Sephering the Aleph Tav. Sephering is one of those, what we called Heblish words, a blend of Hebrew and English. The word Sephir means book or scroll. It also means to count or number or cut hair, a barber, a coiffeur, giving shape to hair. It's also, if you look in the Red Dictionary, it means a frontier. So how do you make sense out of all that? What is Sephir? Is it a book or is it a frontier? If you were to delineate your property out in the yard and you dug holes and put in fence posts along the property line and then strung wire, put a fence, rails between the posts, you're connecting, as it were, the dots. If you're a country or an empire and you establish fortresses spread out along the boundary to protect your people from some encroachment of an enemy, foreign, those forts are like the dots, and the lines between the forts are the Sephering. On the California coast, back in the, must have been the 1700s, I guess, the Spanish, the Catholic padres, went up through the coast of California in about, I believe it was a day's journey between each. They established a mission. San Fernando, Ventura, I think there was one, Santa Barbara, probably Santa Monica. Named them after saints. But anyway, the understanding was they were like inns or hotels where there was a compound, and the Native Americans that were there they used as slaves and workers and recruits, proselytes, to build the missions out of adobe and have a fort and an orchard and farming, and travelers, whoever was going up the coast of California, could stay inside the mission run by the Catholic priests each night. So you're not laying out there in the open to be accosted in the middle of the night by banditos, highwaymen. Anyway, this concept of connecting these intermittent dots is Sephering. Abraham was told to go out and Sephir the stars. It's translated that he was told to count the stars, number the stars, if anybody can do that. That's the way it's phrased in Genesis. And if you think, well, Abraham was out there going, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 5,642, 5,643. Wait a minute, did I count that one? How was he doing that? Millions, billions, trillions of stars. How's he supposed to count the stars? But if he was supposed to Sephir the stars, see, the word Sephir also means to narrate or tell a story. So a cartoon book, comic strip, just has pictures. And it's kind of like a storyboard. If you're writing out a film or a book and you have these basic concepts and then you do the in-betweens, you tie them together. That's Sephir, ing. Ing is the English suffix. So this idea of a storyboard, a comic strip, where you have pictures that you then tie together with the action, well, where do you start and where do you end? Let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. Julie Andrews sang that song in The Sound of Music. You start at the Aleph, and you end at the Tav. So to Sephir Aleph Tav is to connect Aleph to Tav with a story. But how do you do that? Well, if you look at the Hebrew alphabet, there's actually 20 other letters in between Aleph and Tav. Well, who determined that there was 20 other letters between Aleph and Tav? The author of the alphabet. Well, who's that? So the group, Patterns of Evidence, has been making a few videos, movies actually lately, past couple years. I think they've got 4 movies up now, including the Moses controversy and a film about the Exodus and a film about the real Mount Sinai, and the Michael Rood and Ron Wyatt and Cornicky, was it Bob Cornicky, and who's the other guy?
I can't recall.
Anyway, a few different people over the years have done this investigation, and here this other group, Patterns of Evidence, is actually putting in the film. They're doing a pretty nice job of it. You might want to check it out on the online. You can rent or buy the films. The point is, one of their films, they were looking back at the origins of the Hebrew alphabet. And they've got some professional, world-class researchers working on this. I have a little different point of view compared to them, but we're addressing the same subject. My point of view is that humans did not evolve the Hebrew alphabet from the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Humans did not look at Egyptian hieroglyphics, pull out 22 of them, compile them, organize them in a chronological sequence arrangement, and then call that Semitic Hebrew. This is where the disagreement is. I've absolutely firmly believe that Yahuwah, our Elohim, the Kana Shamayim Haaretz, the maker of heaven and earth, he invented, determined, arranged, compiled, and gave sense to, gave meaning to both the order, the sequence of the letters, and the meaning, pictographic, numerical, and however far otherwise deep or vast each letter goes, was his determination. And that he must have then given it to Moshe, at least given it to Moshe. Now the question is, some people say, I guess it's according to the book of Yovelim, which is Jubilees, and or the book of Yashar, which is Jasher, as it's called in English, that Enoch had written some things down and given it to Noah, who carried some book or books on the ark, carried it through the flood, given it to his son Shem, if not to his other 2 sons, Japheth and Ham. Shem would have given it to Abraham. Abraham would have given it at least to Isaac, to Yaakov. Joseph would have had access to it. And if Abraham had the Semitic Hebrew, the Hebrew alphabet in some extent, some form, and if Abraham was told to sephir the stars, the work he did of sephering the stars, telling the story in the stars, it's actually what we would call constellations, connecting the dots with lines, like forts on the outpost of the frontier. That he would have had made that known to Joseph, and Joseph, when he went to Egypt and became what's called vizier, like a prime minister, ruler second only to Pharaoh, he would have incorporated that into his understanding, his wisdom, and Joseph was called in Egypt Zaphnath Paneach, the revealer of secrets, the one who perceives mysteries. But that's in Hebrew. That's a Hebrew word. Zaphnath Paneach is a Hebrew word. So the Egyptian language is very similar to the Hebrew language in, at least as the account we have in the scriptures. Asnath was Joseph's Egyptian wife's name. He named his 2 children Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, that's Hebrew, but it's an Egyptian word apparently. Moshe, Mem Shin He, in English called Moses, is actually named Pharaoh's daughter who drew Moshe out of the Nile River. He was in this little basket like a little mini ark. She named him Moshe, but Moshe is a Hebrew word to be drawn out. He was drawn out of the water. So in Hebrew, all the names are also basically words, like in English. We might have a word like George or James or Sam. It's like, what do those words mean? Well, they go back to having maybe Nordic roots or Latin roots, but in English, the names generally mean nothing. They're just words. They're just sounds. In the 70s, and even nowadays, people started naming their children other things. You know, honeydew. It's the name of a melon, but it's just a nice sounding word. Met a girl the other day up in Oregon named Lyric Wing. Lyric Wing, is that a name? Oh yes, that's her actual name. Beautiful name. So I wrote a poem about that. Read it the other day on a video. It's a real person's name. Well, that's not like John Smith, but what I'm saying is just like the Native Americans would name their people after objects and concepts. So in Hebrew, the names of people and places are meaningful, with substance. So to Sephir would not just be to connect the dots, but also identify the dots, identify the names of cities, identify the names of people. And so, as we said the other day, Chuck Missler back in
96.
96. I suppose he was the first guy that had this idea to do this. He looked at the names of the 10 most ancient patriarchs, starting with Adam, and then not Cain and Abel, but going on to Seth, and then going through and ending with Noah, 10, first series of generations, looked at the basic meanings of the words. Adam means man. Seth is actually Shin Tav. I believe that's how it's spelled.
Missler kind of made a point of that. I don't think he was first. He was kind of saying, you can't tell me that the rabbis haven't seen this.
Anytime you go looking, you're going to see stuff. But the question is, we were never necessarily taught to go looking. And you might say the Jewish world, they've been looking for thousands of years because they had a seriously high regard of the Torah. And the Christian mindset, at least that you might say, was educated with, was that that's all nailed to the cross, doesn't matter. They're under the law. What do they know? It was all a punishment. There's some great stuff. We don't even know the depths of how great the stuff is. So what I'm saying is that the Christian world changed names to be Greco-Roman rather than Hebraic. And what do you call it? Cleansed Hebrew Jewish stuff? What do you call it when you kind of wash something and you modify it, purify it, eradicate any vestige of one culture and make another? Like when Alexander the Great rolled through, conquering nations and cities, he changed their language.
Oh, changed the language, yeah.
When the U.S., British came into Canada and the United States and dominating, taking over, confiscating lands of the Native Americans, they actually took away the language, took away the culture, took away the hairstyle, the clothing style, the housing style. They had to purge, and that might be the word, purge the culture of the indigenous people and replace it, supplant it, overlay it with the conquering culture. There was a famous U.S. policymaker, I forget, maybe it was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, maybe it was a general. He said, they killed a lot of what they called the Indians, but he said, we want to kill the Indian within the Indian, leave the human alive and just kill the native spirit and put on this English-American consciousness, heart, and see if we can save the man and kill the Indian. It's like, what the heck? Anyway, that's getting into a whole other thing. But what I'm saying, that's happened to us. When Yahweh imposed his curse of Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, on the people of Israel, specifically the northern 10 tribes, but also including, to some degree, Yehuda and Benjamin, the southern 2 tribes, that's what happened to us. The identity, the understanding, the heart, the mind, the culture of the kingdom of Yod-He-Vav-He, the kingdom of Yahweh, according to Aleph Tav, was completely lost, eradicated, annihilated. And he allowed his people to be overwhelmed, overcome, and succumbed by their enemies, the foreign nations, who worshipped Elohim Achrim, gods of others, strange deities that don't even exist. He let us be completely bamboozled, bewitched, bewildered, befuddled for the duration of the curse, 2,730 years. But here we are. So what does it mean to come back to the kingdom? We did the video Cultural Evolution. It's like the next phase of development as the big wheel turns, as it were. As various cultures, one comes into the next, comes into the next, comes into the next, like Sephering along the fence posts from this one to this one to this one to this. What's the next one? They, the voices in the media, the voices from the pulpit, are telling us, present tense, here in the year 2020, that the next development, the next phase to be manifest is what they call the New World Order. One world government, one world religion, non-tangible currency, everything run by machines, computers, AI, artificial intelligence. That's what they're telling us. They're telling us that's the next phase of cultural evolution. But in reading the scriptures, what I see, the next phase of cultural evolution, is that the people of Yahweh, the progeny, the seed, the Zerah, the Zion Resh Ayin, the seed, the generations that were cast, our forefathers were cast into the dispersion, the diaspora, the great wandering. We get to come back home to the land of Israel, to the Torah, to comprehending Aleph Tav. Well, the media, the churches, the educators are not going to tell you this. To them, it doesn't even exist. But there's that one verse that I've mentioned before where it talks about Mistress Babylon. And she sits on her throne and she looks around and says, I win. It's only me, no others, no contenders. Nobody to compete with me. Woohoo! But then Yahweh says, oh, but you forgot that I promised my people a future. And from that point, he yanks her off the throne and establishes his people. But you see, if you're not Sephering Aleph Tav, if you're not aware that Yahweh has this thing staged, phased, you don't realize that he has something in front of us other than what they tell you that he has. Oh, read Daniel 7. Read Revelation. What is it? Matthew 24 talks about, oh, things are going to get so bad, so terrible, so horrible. This fourth beast is going to wear down, overwhelm the Kadoshim Elyonim, the saints. Is that what it says? Oh, yeah, look at it. You can read it in English right there. Perfectly clear English. Doesn't the God of the heavens have the power to maintain the correct translation of his words from Hebrew into English or Aramaic into English? Sure he does. So, I'm convinced that he, in order to maintain and sustain the diaspora for 2,730 years, used the Greeks, the Romans, the British, the Americans, and whoever else, the powers that we see that exist, dominating world government, world authority, banking systems. He's used them and allowed them to translate the scripture. Maybe they thought they were doing it right. Maybe they were doing it deviously. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But it's not clearly what the Hebrew says. It disagrees with the Hebrew. Then I'm left with saying, well, do I believe what they tell me it says, or if I Sephir Aleph Tav, what does it tell me? Well, it all depends on how you give value or merit or weight to each one of the letters of Aleph through Tav. The significance of the Mishkan Pattern is that it's the Mishkan, translated tabernacle, dwelling place. Moshe didn't invent that. Some people think that Moshe out of his own whimsical imagination, wrote the Torah. Oh, God told me how to write this. That's what people think. Or they think that at least 5, if not a half a dozen or more, people wrote the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and claimed it was Moses. In other words, the world's greatest scholars think that the Hebrews are lying. The Hebrew-minded, the Jews who interpret the Hebrew words, Moshe heard from Elohim and wrote these words, and then when Yahweh said in Leviticus 23, these are my moedim, my moedi, actually, and wrote them down, and these are the laws, and these are the... They think that Moshe invented the whole thing and wrote down all these. That's why he's called Moshe the lawgiver. It's not Moshe the lawgiver. Yahuwah is the lawgiver. The point is, the people that have been teaching, and when I say British American, is that's my heritage. Who knows what's been going on in the rest of the face of the world, the other continents, but at least the British came out of the Roman, which came out of they overwhelmed the Greek, but it's called Greco-Roman, and Western, Occidental, the Oriental, the Eastern has its own thing happening, similar but different. And then the British came to America, and America never shirked off the British culture or the British authority or the British interpretation of law or the meanings of words. We may think we're independent, which we're not. That's a whole other story. But what I'm saying is we have inherited whatever distortions, whatever point of view, and here we are reading King James English. Oh, it's the most refined, the most authoritative. I've heard numerous sermons on that matter. But then if I can find any place, much more, many places where the King James has not accurately translated, then it's like, well, the Holy Spirit has maintained that translation and called it the authorized King James. Well, then he must have done it to sustain the obfuscation. Or you can believe whatever you want. Believe my perspective to be heathen, pagan, distorted, confused, maniac if you want to. Believe whatever you want. Make up your own doctrines or listen to your favorite preacher. He'll tell you. But if we can look at the Mishkan pattern that Yahuwah in Exodus 25 said was his own invention, and he showed it to Moshe. And then in Leviticus 23 he says, these are my moedi, and he tells them to Moshe. And in Genesis 1, there was no human, there was no religious authority, there was no political entity. Yahuwah predetermined by his own imagination, his own volition, his own big idea. These are the sequence of the 7 days of creation. It's all his. And then when you see the pattern of the 7 days, the Mishkan, the Moedim, perfectly correlate thematically, then the Sephering of the 7 days in sequence, the Sephering of the 7 Moedim, the Sephering of the pattern of the Mishkan, when you realize it's exactly the same story. So I realized back in 2004 that there's a message in the pattern itself. Not just the over story, but in the placement of those dots, those forts, those fence posts, identical in each, and then in the Beatitudes, when Yeshua sat down on the mountain and he gave the Sermon on the Mount, exactly the same pattern. And then finding hundreds of places, literally about 500 places in the Scripture, same pattern, same way of interpreting the pattern, of Sephering the pattern. Well, the pattern was only 7 pieces, or maybe 8 or 9 pieces, depending on how you want to look at it, but typically the basic pattern was 7. But there's 22 letters in the Aleph Bet. So how do you fit 7 into 22? Well, 22 divided by 7 happens to be 3.14, which is the value of pi, which is a Greek letter speaking of the relationship of a circle to its radius, the circumference to a radius. Well, if you're a mathematician, that's significant. If you're not a mathematician, it's like, pi. Did somebody say pie? Boy, Rhonda makes an amazing lemon meringue pie. So does my mom. She said, boy, 2 best lemon meringue pies I think I've ever eaten. What's that got to do with anything? Well, we're talking about pi, aren't we? No, we're talking about the Mishkan pattern, 22 divided by 7. So you look at the menorah. And there was 7 branches. And it said in Exodus 25, make the menorah and have 3, as it were, knobs or cups or bowls. Were they knobs, bulbous, or were they bulbs or cups? That same Hebrew word can be translated both ways. Have 3 on each of the 6 branches and 4 on the branch in the middle. Well, that's a total of 22. So the menorah was made to have 22 cups divided onto 7 branches. There's pi, 3.14. So I believe, in my imagination, though I've never seen anybody else make it this way, I made a couple of menorahs like this, where perhaps those bowls held the oil. So each one branch had 3 bowls with 3 wicks, and so when the priest would come in and trim the wicks, you trim one at a time so the light would never go out on one of the branches of the menorah, even if you were adjusting, trimming, putting a new wick on. And so if it said there was 1 reflector, so imagine you had 3 dishes with wicks of flames, 3 flames on each branch, with 1 reflector behind it. And it said, turn the reflector towards the front. Well, I had an old, I believe it was probably kerosene lantern one time that had 2 wicks inside, and it was a novelty when it was first invented. The point is to have 3 lights would put out a pretty good light, and if one of them went out, you're not losing one of those flames, and so it seems reasonable. 4 in the middle, so you'd have 22 lights divided by the 7 branches. Well, there's a pictograph, a picturesque rendering of the alphabet. 22 letters divided by 7. Well, so how is that? Well, the Mishkan pattern is 7. This is a different elaboration, but what I'm saying is to Sephir Aleph Tav can mean, oh, just realize that there's a beginning, there's an end, and there's something in between. What's in between? The history of mankind. Well, what's also in between is I believe, in the alphabet, in the Hebrew alphabet, is the identity of HaMashiach. Whoever that might be, the Messiah. Now, some people say it's Rabbi, was it Schneerson? Isn't that who they said was the Messiah?
Oh, yeah.
Is he? Well, discuss it.
He died.
He died. Well, is he going to raise from the dead? Well,
they hung around for a few days, but he didn't come back.
But people really, true, heartfelt believers, were believing that Rabbi Schneerson was the Messiah of Israel. Was it Jesus? Was it Yeshua? Was it somebody else? Maybe the Messiah hasn't yet come. Who is it? Instead of arguing, oh, we know it's this guy, whoa, just step back. I'm proposing that the sequence of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet is the formula, the prophecy, the conditions that whoever the Messiah is must meet these 22 conditions. So if you want to discuss that, we'd have to look at the 22 letters. And if you're just going to believe what your preacher told you or believe what the historian told you, both of whom have been running an agenda of deception, typically, not everyone, but typically that's the mission that those guys run by the Pope or run by the culture or run by Yahweh himself. He said he would blind the eyes of the seers, confuse the minds of the wise men, bring a shroud of darkness on his people. Yahweh said that. I'm not blaming the devil. I'm not blaming people or human authorities. I'm saying that's the condition that the world has been in for all these years. Okay, so here we are. So what do? Look at the Hebrew alphabet. So for me to encourage people to learn Hebrew, this is why. To say, well, you better learn Hebrew or you're going to burn in hell. No, didn't say that. To say, well, you better learn Hebrew. No, I didn't say that either. I said there's merit. There's a lot of fun. There's great insight. There's enlightenment. There's wisdom in the Hebrew alphabet. And I believe that Yahweh is in there, that the Mashiach is in there. The Ruach is in these letters. So if that's worth your attention, then look at the Hebrew alphabet. I was never encouraged to look at the Hebrew alphabet. And I really don't know other people that were. I know people that have been to seminary and to Bible college and studied the Bible and read the Bible and never had the thought, never even had the fleeting, maybe I should look at the Hebrew. No, never happened. So I'm trying to promote that as if, well, this is the next phase. This is the next step of progression. The next dot to connect in the Sephering of human history is this moment, this occasion, to look at the Hebrew alphabet, and that the Ruach of Yahweh is all over it, is completely in it and through it, and as much as he hid and blinded the eyes and obfuscated the understanding of these things for a season in the past because of the curse that he imposed on his people, so too now we are at the threshold of the enlightenment, the understanding, the beholding, the perceiving of the great mysteries, Zaphnath Panach. And it's available to all of us, not just to one man, Joseph. But here we are. So how do we do that? Well, start at the very beginning. The only way to start at the beginning of Aleph and Tav is to realize that Aleph is the beginning and Tav is the ending. If you believe that this was a human invention, well, is it worth your time or not? Well, maybe. But if you believe that Yahuwah himself, your Elohim, your God of gods, if you want to use those words, your Lord of lords, your King of kings, himself invented and placed these 22 letters. The one who you yearn to spend eternity with, this is his stuff. His mind put these together. His heart, filled with passion, is what went into these letters. His gift to human beings to be made in his image is about these 22 letters, because these 22 letters are his image that humans were made in. There's a concept. What does that mean? When he said that humans were made in his image, I don't believe it meant that he's got a head, a neck, a torso, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 feet. That's not the image we were made in. We were made in the image of the 22 letters of the alphabet. Then to get into a Christian concept, for the Messiah to be born as a human means that he was born into the image of the human, physically, circumstantially, mentally, intellectually. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the human beings being made in his image were physically, because he physically didn't have a physique. He, the Almighty, the Infinite One, immaterial one, has no form that he should be beheld, has no physicality. Now, for the Almighty Infinite One to invent a human being with a form that he molded out of clay, like children playing with Play-Doh, making an image of a human, stick figure as it were, and then he breathed in a ruach, a breath of animation, life. Now that's a human being with a personal identity, and as human beings procreate, then each one of them has a different identity. And then if he says, you know, I'm going to somehow do that also. I'm going to take myself and put myself into this human being. No, he can't do that. He wouldn't ever do that. Well, that's what we're told by the Jewish wise men. That he can't and wouldn't. Why not? Can he not do anything he wants? If he wanted to do that, could he do that? It's his prerogative to do that. Well, then why jump up and down and pound and insist that he couldn't and wouldn't? He could and would if he wanted to. So for me to believe that somehow the omnipotent, eternal, the infinite one would take some aspect of himself, whatever that means, he had to figure out how to do it. If he would, then he could, but did he? That's the big question. But if he would, if he could he put some sense of himself into this humanoid image? Well, if you think he couldn't, he wouldn't, well, then you can stop your Sephering right there. But we're trying to look at imagery of the Aleph Bet. We're trying to start with Aleph. Aleph is used as a pronoun in the Hebrew alphabet, meaning I am or I will. It's self-referential of the author of what's about to be said. If you spell a word and start it with an aleph, if the word is a verb, then it's basically saying I am or I will do this. I am doing this. I am being this. So if the alphabet was written as a communication, a communique, then the aleph is self-referential of the one on the other side of the aleph who is projecting this communique. But the aleph is silent. The aleph is not uttered. By default, it's given an eh sort of articulation. When you speak the aleph like et is the way you pronounce aleph tav, but the aleph is silent. So technically you should pronounce the aleph tav as t. That's just the sound of the tav, the T sound. But some people say it's a TH sound, and some people say the tav is pronounced as an S. So maybe the aleph tav just is pronounced as s. Doesn't work. So some, like that publishing group, ETH, Sephir, and they spell the word Sephir with a C. Well, I spell it with an S because Sephir is spelled with a samach peresh. But aleph tav, ETH, I would pronounce it et. Some people pronounce it S. The point of the matter is I'm trying to clarify what might be confusing to some people who haven't already investigated these matters. Here's my point, though, conceptually. If the aleph represents the one who is now going to project the utterance, then aleph being silent, well, here, let's take a look at this universe. What we see is blue sky in day, black sky with stars at night. We see wood, rocks, water, 200 or so elements in the periodic table which compose all this. But where's the source? Invisible. Where's the voice of he who made this? It's silent. There's a great mystery. In the book of Genesis, the very first word is pronounced Bereshit or Bereshith. Bereshis. I say Bereshit. It starts with the letter B, the sound B, the letter bet, the English letter B. Why does it start with B instead of A? Why does it start with bet instead of aleph? Why would you start in the very beginning, Genesis 1, verse 1, and start with 2? Bet is 2. Why not start with 1? Where's the 1? Well, I believe that the mystery is in Sephering. Look at it closely. The aleph is silent. The aleph represents the one who put bet into place. So the universe, see, bet means house. Well, the universe is our house, our realm. Time and space is bet. So who put bet here? The aleph. Well, who is the aleph? Silent. Non-disclosure. Well, if the aleph doesn't communicate who it or he or she or what, if the aleph doesn't communicate itself, there's no way for us to know. We could guess. So humans throughout human history have guessed that the sun is the deity, or that there's many deities, overlords, known as Baals in the Hebrew language, titans, various Greek and Roman gods, deities, were considered the rulers, the perpetrators, the responsible individuals, the parties that controlled and messed with and pushed things around in this realm. But the Elohim of the Hebrews claims that he's the one and only, and that none of these other deities even exist. No other deities exist. We could say, well, gosh, there's evidence that some other deities exist because there's at least the devil. And people say, well, the devil's not a god. Well, no, the word Elohim means powerful one who can affect things and who can exert his will onto the course of human endeavors to distort and disturb them. And so whether you like it or not, the devil is a type of God. But when Moshe, when he was 80 years old, he was out shepherding his father-in-law, Yithro, his father-in-law's flock in Midian. And all of a sudden he saw this sight. It was a bush on fire, which, why would there be a bush on fire in the middle of nowhere? Well, it could happen. Maybe a lightning strike, maybe sun on a piece of obsidian or glass or something that caused some heat. There might be but Moshe said, wow, what the heck? But he looked closer and the bush was not being consumed. It wasn't turning black. It was just burning. So he went to look. Well, this is in Exodus chapter 3. And it says that Elohim noticed that Moshe noticed. And he says, now I've got his attention. Now I'm going to communicate something to him. And so we read the story in English, but there's a whole other way to read it in Hebrew. Not only reading the Hebrew words, but looking at the Hebrew letters that spell those words, there's a whole other way to read this story. Moshe asked of the voice speaking to him, who had just commissioned him to go back to Egypt and talk to Pharaoh and let his people go. Release all your 3 million slaves. We're going to go worship our Elohim in the wilderness. Why should the Pharaoh let him go? It would have upset the entire economy. The entire culture of Egypt would have instantly changed. Why would the Pharaoh do that? Only if he recognized a higher authority or recognized something in it for him, which he didn't. But nevertheless, the development of the story through the book of Exodus is what follows. But Moshe said to the voice speaking to him, he didn't say, who are you that's speaking to me? He had a recognition of who or what sort of powerful entity was speaking to him. But what Moshe said was, when I go speak to the leaders of Israel who are being held captive in Egypt and kind of propose this whole plan to them, who shall I say sent me? Interesting angle that Moshe took. And the voice said, tell them, Ehyeh Asher, Ehyeh. Aleph He Yod He, Aleph Shin Resh, Aleph He Yod He. However you want to pronounce that. Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh. Then he said, tell them Ehyeh sent you. Okay. But then he goes on to say, Yahuwah, Yod He Vav He. Different spelling, different sounding. Yahuwah is my Shem, in English, Shem of Zakar, name of remembrance, memorial name, commemorative name that will either cause them to remember, or that which they ought to remember, or that which will bring back the recollection of all the significant things. That's Yod He Vav He. But he was to tell his people that Aleph He Yod He is the one that sent him. Well, that's been translated into the phrase, I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. But that's a translation. It's more like the one who not only exists, but who causes everything to exist, or the one who intended or organized what does exist. Aleph He Yod He. If you read those letters, Aleph is this first letter, the invisible, silent, omnipotent, eternal, unfathomable one, will manifest, that's the letter He, in the creation, the letter Yod, that which is built by his proverbial hand, and then what is built will express, that's the second He, according to what he intended for the creation to manifest from his original plan. So the way to read this Ehyeh is looking at the letters and then reading the letters backwards and then putting them together. But how do we know what the letters mean? Well, the letters have to mean something. So if we start with Aleph, that the plan is to put into the creation an expression of the plan of what he wanted to say, then that means if he uses the 10th letter, the letter Yod, to mean what he put in the creation, then he had to establish that that letter Yod had a meaning, and that it would mean this is what the creation is, this working hand. That had to be before he ever built anything else. Before he ever made the creation, he had to determine what Aleph He Yod He would mean by building it into creation. And that the idea that creation could be read or interpreted, that's what science is, or sephired, that's the He of the Yod. The fact that we can look at what exists, visible and invisible, invisible meaning things like ultraviolet and radio, those are invisible, but yet they work. We deal with them every day. That which exists within this realm of the universe, the cosmos, the matter of our time and space, whatever that is the Yod, and that can be read or interpreted or perceived or sephired, that's the second He. But the fact that this is an expression, which is the first He, of what the Aleph intended, well, that's kind of what the word Aleph He Yod He means. It doesn't just mean I exist. The verb He Yod He, Haya, means to exist. So Aleph He Yod He means I exist. But it's more than that. It's that the one who does exist, who caused everything else to exist, had a plan, had an intention which was expressed in this hand that expresses. But that means he had to determine that there would be a hand that expresses. So he had to figure out and determine that the letter He meant to express, and that the letter Yod was this hand, which would be the 10th letter, the He was the 5th letter. Well, then that means he had to figure out the meaning of the letters of the alphabet before he even made the universe. And when he said his name to be remembered would be Yod He Vav He, then we can look at it and say, well, that's the letter 10, 5, 6, and then 5. So the letter 10, the 10th letter, being Yod, means the hand of the Creator, expresses He. And then there's the letter Vav. Well, the letter Vav is a nail. A nail, an attachment device. But in the book of Revelation, which came thousands of years later, it says that the number 6 is the number of man. It doesn't say the Vav is a man, it's the number of man. But Vav is also the masculine suffix if you spell words. Did he figure all this out? Well, if he invented the Hebrew language, then he, Ehyeh, known as Yahweh, would have predetermined that the letter Vav had to do with man or humankind. And that would express something, He. So we have in Yod He Vav He, the Creator, or in the creation is expressed a connection with mankind expressed. What does that mean? The only way you can know what that means is by reading those 3 types of letters, the Yod, the He, and the Vav, and put it in the context of the human mind. Well, the human mind perceives. That's kind of a Vav He. What the intention of the creation was built to express. That's the Yod He. So here we have Aleph He Yod He and Yod He Vav He talking about this esoteric concept of the relationship between the infinite Almighty and the finite, weak and powerless in comparison, but that there was this connection through the creation. Well, so for humans to look at the sun and say, let's worship the sun or the deity represented by the sun, and Yahweh says, no, don't do that. Well, let's look at the, if you look at the ocean, and so they come up with different deities' names for who might be ruling the ocean, and Yahweh says, that's me also. Don't even imagine those other deities. Don't even think about them. Well, then the only way to accurately regard, register, and deal with the Creator of the heavens and the earth is through the Hebrew alphabet, because that's what he ordained, instituted, implemented, and gave human beings to relate to him with. This word of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And then that word itself, the 22-letter Hebrew alphabet, put itself somehow into the human being and walked amongst us, according to the Gospel of the book of John in the 1st chapter, and the Word became flesh. So that's the Mashiach. That Word becoming flesh. That Word that came from Aleph, and how it came from Aleph is his business, he didn't tell us. But to become a human form, to enter into this cosmos, is Bet. So the Aleph, somehow, by its own volition, became Betness. The Alephnis became Betness, which became Vavness, Waness, Mashiach. But he told us not to worship the man. He said, you heard a voice, you did not see any likeness, not male or female, not a reptile, not an animal, not a bird, not a fish. Do not worship the sun or the stars. Do not worship the man or the woman. Worship Elohim Ehyeh. So is Jesus Christ God? Isn't that the question you were asked?
Yeah.
And the guy was saying, what, that we're heathen infidels if we won't answer this question? Well, we'll elaborate a little bit more. We're at the end of this video.
Yeah, we'll pick that up.
We'll pick this up and then take it into another phase of, there's this book I wrote, Sephering Aleph Tav. The people at Aleph Tav Sephir put me up to it, but then they rejected it. So, we're going to read from this in a video in a few minutes.
All right, bro. Thank you.